Hey PCWorld fans, Adam here with Jeff from Craft Computing. Jeff, I look to you for all of my home lab and server information. So I have a question for you, and this is something that gets brought up on our podcast a lot. Do you think it's worth it to invest in older server gear? Something like a Xeon, right?
Right.
I know there's a lot of old Xeon parts out there. People are like, oh, you know what, I can still use that. And usually the two cases that I kind of see are either workstation or gaming. So let's start off with one. Let's start off with gaming.
Yep.
Do you think it's worth to get some of these older server parts versus newer platforms for something like gaming?
Something like used Xeons or used Epyc CPUs, those are also starting to hit the market fairly inexpensively. It's a question I dive into quite a bit on my channel. Subscribe, Craft Computing, down below. The answer, like all things, is it kind of depends. It depends on what you're after. Used server gear can be a fantastic way to find super low budget parts to be able to play games, to be able to assemble your own workstation. Mm-hmm. But it all depends on what you actually want out of it. If you're looking for top flight, 4K gaming, the answer is no. Used server gear is not going to hold up to the rigors of modern games, especially with graphics cards that we have out right now, like a 7900 XT or a 4090. Those are not going to be a great pairing. You're going to have a massive CPU bottleneck.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so I would think you typically at high resolutions the CPU matters less, but where's the bottleneck coming from?
Even on these older Xeons, you have to figure the Xeons that are on the market right now are Broadwell and Haswell generation. So you're thinking fourth and fifth generation Intel. They don't have the clock speeds that modern CPUs do. A lot of these CPUs are peaking out at like 3.4 gigahertz. They're not hitting 5 and 5.5. And even at 4K, we're starting to see CPUs needing to hold up in that higher spectrum. However, for more of the budget system use cases, where you are only doing 1080p or maybe 1440, you have a lower power graphics card, let's say an RTX 4060 or an AMD 7600. These can absolutely be a great pairing to get you that level of performance, because you're not expecting 250 FPS out of them. You're expecting 90 to 120 FPS out of them. These CPUs can still hold up with that level of graphics card.
Well, is it still going to be cost efficient though? Like, versus getting, like a low-end Ryzen or a low-end Core processor?
It definitely can be, and again, it's kind of managing your expectations. Even getting into a low power or a low dollar budget system from either Intel or AMD, you're looking about $100 for the CPU, for like a 13100, for example. Mm-hmm. You're looking minimum about $90 for a motherboard. If you want to pair that with 16 gigabytes of RAM, you're probably looking between $50 and $65 today. You're looking, $250, trending $300 just for your base platform, for your motherboard, CPU, and memory. A lot of these Xeon platforms can be had with a lot of the AliExpress motherboards that I've covered on my channel. You can get an AliExpress motherboard for about $50 to $60. You can get an 8-core Xeon chip that fits in there for about $50 as well. Those also use server DDR4, so registered ECC, which can be had much, much cheaper than consumer memory. So instead of $250 or $300 for a platform, you're looking $110, $120 for your full base platform.
But you don't need ECC memory if you're just gaming.
No, if you're just gaming, you don't need ECC memory. But because a lot of the ECC memory is used and refurbished, pulled out of working server gear, instead of paying $25 to $30 for an 8 gigabyte stick, you're paying $5 to $10 for an 8 gigabyte stick. You can get a lot more memory for a lot less money.
Really interesting. Okay, well, what about reliability? Because when I think server gear, I think lots of uptime. It's going to be put through the ringer. It's like always on and always being worked.
If you're buying a used Xeon from Intel's 5th generation, that means that CPU has been on since that CPU released with the 5th generation.
Right. So is it reliable?
The CPUs I've found to be incredibly reliable.
Oh.
As far as the motherboards go, I've reviewed a number of different motherboards from AliExpress, be they X79 or X99. I have had only one failure in the last 6 years of building these systems.
Wow. Huh. Oh, okay. And what about the RAM?
The RAM, same thing.
Same thing.
I really haven't run into any errors in memory as well.
Huh. All right, so the other side of the coin is Workstation. When I think of these kind of server chips, I think, oh, wow, you can get a lot of cores for real cheap. How does that equation change for Workstation? You know, say rendering or video editing or 3D workstation kind of
Yeah,
stuff?
a common question that I get all the time is, you know, I want to build a workstation so I can do, you know, video editing or a CAD workstation or something like that.
Yeah.
You can definitely get a lot of cores really, really cheap. Right now, you can get an Intel Xeon, a 2699 V3, which is an 18-core part, for under $100.
It's a lot of cores.
That's a lot of cores. They're a base clock of 2.3 gigahertz and a max turbo of, I think, 3.6, but your all-core turbo is going to be somewhere in the 2.7-ish range. They're not exactly the most performant cores, even though you get a lot of them. Now, you also have to think that back in 5th generation Xeon, when we were on 14 nanometer with only 1 plus on it, you know, we weren't exactly setting the world on fire when it came to single-threaded performance. We got kind of the same performance year over year. Just looking at like Cinebench R15, that same 2.7 gigahertz Xeon would score about maybe a 135, 140 in single-threaded performance.
Okay.
Some of the higher-end systems from that day, from Haswell, Broadwell, even Skylake, were scoring in the 170s, 180s, similar to first-generation Ryzen. Modern CPUs are scoring in the 315, 350. Even though you have so many cores on the 18-core Xeon, it might be worth it to look at an 8-core modern CPU, something like a Ryzen 7700 or a 12600K.
Well, but maybe here is where the ECC memory can help, or the more PCIe lanes.
Correct. Yeah, with Xeon platforms and Epyc platforms especially, you get a lot more PCI Express lanes. So if you had, if you wanted to build an AI server at home with a whole bunch of graphics cards, you can actually load 4, 5, or 6 graphics cards into a single system with a single processor. Versus modern CPU platforms, you're getting maybe 24 PCI Express lanes in total. Memory bandwidth dependent things. We're still using DDR4 on these server platforms, but at 2666 megahertz. But you have 4 channels, or sometimes 8 channels on AMD Epyc. So even though we're only running at 2666, you have maybe 2 to 3 times the memory bandwidth of modern consumer platforms. So again, it's kind of about managing your expectations on what your specific needs are. Is your application memory dependent? Is it PCI Express dependent? Is it single-threaded or multi-threaded dependent? And pricing out your system based on that.
I mean, I would also throw in stability, because if these have been around for a long time, they're dependable. They're probably not getting updated that often anymore. Things like that. Like if you're doing work that like your work depends on or you depend on your work for getting paid, then you want something that's super reliable. And the newest consumer-based chips are not always the most reliable.
When you're living at the bleeding edge of performance and your system is automatically overclocking your CPU 5.6, 5.8 gigahertz, you're living on a knife's edge of stability, and that's kind of by design of these modern chips. Whereas if you're running a Haswell chip at 3.6 gigahertz, but the enthusiast chips of those days, had no problem hitting 4.6 or 5, you're going to be in a pretty good space as far as running at that clock speed 24/7.
Okay, well, the last question, this applies to gaming, but I think it would be more of a workstation thing as well. What about power and heat? Because in a server, maybe it's in some sort of server rack, it's cooled, and you don't care how loud it's going to be and how hot it gets. What is it like, if you're going to use this on your desktop?
Amazingly enough, because of the architecture of Epyc and Xeon CPUs, they're usually much larger CPU dies. The cores are spread over a much larger area, more surface contact, more thermal transference. So you can actually use smaller heat sinks and smaller water coolers by comparison on similar wattage parts.
Oh, what about power draw? Is it... Yeah.
Power draw is another story. A lot of these server platforms, like the Intel Xeons from the X99 days, they could draw in excess of about 140 to 160 watts. If you start getting into AMD Epyc on Naples and Rome, you're talking about 180 or 200 watt CPUs. While some modern consumer chips, 13900K, they're spiking, 300.
Yeah, I was about to say, I was like,
times.
actually, it's not too bad compared to...
Right, right, so...
But we're talking more entry level compared to an i3 or Ryzen 3. Or
Correct.
like
Yeah.
that.
If you're coming from a perspective of budget wise, a Ryzen 3 or an i3 processor, those are 65 watt parts.
Yeah,
You're definitely not going to win on the efficiency side of things.
Oh, okay. Well, a lot to think about. I mean, I have always thought about maybe trying to get something online. What are the most reputable places to kind of dip into that? Is it eBay? Or are you just kind of throwing the chance over there?
eBay, AliExpress, actually, and even on Amazon, you can find some of these motherboards.
New or used?
New.
Wow. Okay.
There's a number of different Chinese manufacturers. There's Jingsha, there's Hunanji, that all make brand new motherboards for a lot of these platforms.
Wow. Okay, I just assumed you're only getting used parts from that. Oh, okay, interesting. All right, well, if people wanted to know more about this, sounds like you've got quality content over on Craft Computing, right?
That's right.
Yeah, be sure to go subscribe over there. Thank you, Jeff, for answering my stupid questions here. I appreciate it, and thanks everybody for watching. Once again, Craft Computing. Go watch Jeff's channel. If you want to watch more fun interviews like this, then subscribe here on PC World. And until the next one, we'll catch you later.
Cheers, everyone.